Jonah bought the land for its silence. 300 acres of thistle and rock that the folks in Harmony called the curse. They spoke of it in hushed tones of a tragedy that had soured the soil and left a ghost to wander the crumbling homestead. Jonah didn't care about ghosts. He was a man who had been carrying his own for so long that the company of one more hardly mattered. He paid his money for the silence for a place vast enough to bury his past. He expected hardship wind and the slow work of mending fences. He never expected the silence to have a voice or the ghost to have eyes the color of a gathering storm. He saw her the first evening, a silhouette framed by the blood-orange sunset on the porch of the derelict cabin. She wasn't an apparition. She was steel and bone, holding a long rifle, not as a threat, but as if it were a third arm. Her hair was a wild tangle of sun and dust, but her stance was rooted to the ground, as immovable as the ancient rocks behind her. She was the land's sentinel. He reined his horse in the tired creak of leather, a trespass in the heavy air. "The name's Jonah," he said, his voice low and even a stone skipping across a still pond. "Bought the paper on this plot." Her eyes narrowed, tracking him with a predator's focus. "Paper burns," she answered, her voice a low rasp like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The land remembers." He didn't challenge her. He couldn't. Her truth was older and harder than his. He simply dismounted, a quiet concession. That night he made his camp a respectful distance away under the wide, unblinking eye of the moon. He had come seeking an empty world to lose himself in. He hadn't realized he had just entered hers, and she had no intention of letting him claim it without a fight. The quiet he had paid for was now charged with a tense, watchful energy. It was the silence of two predators circling the same territory. The first week was a silent war of attrition. Jonah rose with the sun, the rhythmic thud of his hammer on fence posts, a steady declaration of his intent to stay. He worked the edges of the property, his back always to the cabin, a deliberate geography of respect. He was claiming the boundaries, not the heartland. He could feel her gaze on him throughout the day, a tangible pressure on his skin, but he never looked up to meet it. He was a patient man. He could wait. The truce began not with a word, but with a trade. He left a sack of flour on a sun-bleached rock that marked the invisible line between their territories. It was an acknowledgement, a tribute to the reigning monarch of this forgotten kingdom. For a full day it sat there, a white flag in the dust. The next morning it was gone. In its place was a small pile of freshly dug potatoes, the dark, rich earth still clinging to them. The bartering became their language. His salted pork for a brace of rabbits, cleaned with a hunter's skill. His coffee for a bundle of wild mint. Through these silent exchanges, he pieced together the story of her existence. He saw the intelligence in her snares, the fierce determination in the small protected patch of green she coaxed from the stubborn soil. This was not a spirit bound by tragedy. This was a woman who had bent the will of a cursed land to her own, a woman who had refused to be broken by whatever tragedy had tried to bury her here. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a space of negotiation, of a slow, wary assessment. The sky broke without preamble. One moment it was a sheet of hot blue steel. The next, it was a dark, churning bruise. The storm hit not with rain, but with a physical weight, a violent deluge that turned the dry creek bed into a raging brown river. Jonah found meager shelter in a rock crevice, the wind howling a predatory song. And through that chaos, he saw her. She was on her knees in the mud, a desperate feral figure fighting the flood. The torrent was destroying her garden, the one small testament to life in this desolate place. She was trying to build a dam with her bare, bleeding hands, a futile, heartbreaking battle against the indifferent rage of the storm. In that instant, Jonah's carefully constructed wall of solitude crumbled. This wasn't about land or deeds anymore. This was about watching a soul fight for the one thing it had and lose. He ran out into the blinding rain, his boots instantly heavy with mud. He tore a thick plank from the collapsing barn, plunged it into the earth and threw his entire weight against it, creating a new channel for the water. She looked up, startled, her face a mask of mud and rain. Seeing his purpose, she scrambled to join him, her small frame a force of nature in its own right. They worked in a frantic, mud-soaked silence, their movements a synchronized dance of desperation. They were no longer two separate beings on a piece of land. They were partners in a war against the sky. When the storm finally passed, spent and murmuring, they stood in the aftermath, leaning on their makeshift tools, their chests heaving. The garden, though, battered, was saved. A muddy, ugly, but effective trench now protected it. She straightened up, her breath still coming in ragged clouds in the cool air. She looked at him, her stormy eyes holding his for the first time without the shield of defiance. "My father would have let it wash away," she said, her voice a raw, quiet thing. "He would have called it God's will." She took a step closer, her gaze dropping to his hands, which were scraped and raw. "You are not him." It was the most profound thing she could have said. It wasn't an invitation, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was an observation, a distinction, and in the clean, rain-washed air of the cursed land, it was everything. That evening, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney for the first time since his arrival. It was a signal fire, a summons. Jonah approached the porch with the caution of a man entering a wolf's den, but the door was already ajar. He stepped inside. The cabin was a single room stripped bare of all but the essentials, a cot, a rough table, and 2 chairs. It was clean, the floorboards swept, the surfaces wiped. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing the damp chill from the air. She was there, standing by the fire, stirring a small pot that sent a rich, savory steam into the room. She didn't look at him, but gestured with her head toward one of the chairs. He sat. She ladled a thick rabbit stew into 2 chipped enamel bowls and placed one in front of him. They ate in a silence that was no longer tense, but thick with the unspoken events of the day. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft click of their spoons against the bowls. This was more than a meal. It was a ritual, a breaking of bread that sealed the truce they had forged in the storm. When they were finished, she took his empty bowl, and he noticed for the first time the network of faint silvery scars that crisscrossed the backs of her hands. Old wounds, a map of a life he couldn't begin to imagine. "Maeve," she said, her back to him as she stood by the wash basin. Jonah looked up, startled. She turned her head slightly, her profile etched in the firelight. "My name. It's Maeve." He nodded slowly, the name settling into the quiet space around him. "Jonah," he repeated his own, as if for the first time. It was a formal introduction, made in the heart of a ruin on a piece of land the world had forgotten. That night, Jonah returned to his camp under the stars, but the solitude no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like an absence. He had shared a meal in her house, he knew her name, and the invisible line between their territories had been washed away by the rain. The cabin door was no longer a barrier between them. In the days that followed, their territories merged. Jonah still slept at his camp, a silent acknowledgement of her space, but he took his meals with her. He brought his skill as a carpenter to the homestead, and the sound of his hammer now had a different purpose. He didn't just mend fences, he rebuilt the crumbling porch, his movements sure and steady under her watchful eye. The homestead began to feel less like a ruin and more like a work in progress. In return, she shared the land's secrets with him. She showed him which plants were medicine and which were poison. She taught him to read the clouds, to anticipate the wind. She led him to a hidden spring of clean, sweet water he would never have found on his own. She was the land's memory, and she was slowly, cautiously entrusting it to him. He learned pieces of her story not through questions, but through quiet observation. He saw the way she'd flinch if he moved too quickly behind her. He saw the deep ingrained habit of saving every last scrap of food. And one afternoon he found the graves, 2 simple, unmarked stone piles behind a cluster of junipers. She found him standing there, his hat in his hands. "My folks," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The fever took them. I was 12. She looked at the graves, then back at him. The town sent a man to take me. From the church. He said this place was godless. He had hard hands. She didn't need to say more. The way her own hands tightened into fists said the rest. She had run from him and had been running ever since. Jonah looked from the small graves to the fierce, solitary woman before him. He finally understood. She wasn't a curse. She was a guardian. She was protecting not just the land, but the memory of the only family she had ever known. She had chosen this harsh, lonely existence over the charity of a cruel world. He didn't offer words of comfort. They would have been cheap and meaningless. Instead, he reached down, picked up 2 flat, smooth stones from the creek bed, and spent the rest of the afternoon carefully carving their names into them with the tip of his knife. Eleanor and James Miller. He didn't know if the names were right, but he gave them names. He gave them dignity. When he was done, he set the new headstones in place. Maeve watched the entire time, silent. When he stood, she simply said, "Their names were Rose and Thomas." But her voice wasn't correcting him. It was thanking him. And for the first time, the stormy sea in her eyes was calm. That act of quiet reverence changed everything. The last wall between them crumbled. Jonah moved his bedroll from the camp into the newly repaired barn closer to the heart of the homestead. The cabin was her space, the barn was his, but the land between was theirs. They worked it together, a seamless, silent team. The garden doubled in size. The fences stood straight and true. The homestead no longer looked like it was dying. It looked like it was taking a deep, slow breath. The town of Harmony, on Jonah's rare trips for supplies, still spoke of the Miller curse. But now they spoke of him too, the quiet cowboy who had gone to live with the ghost. They didn't understand, and Jonah didn't bother to explain. One evening, as the first chill of autumn sharpened the air, they sat on the porch he had built, watching the stars prick the deep indigo sky. It had become their ritual. "You never told me," Maeve said, her voice soft in the darkness, "what ghosts you were running from." Jonah was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the star-dusted plains. "I wasn't a cowboy," he finally said. "Not always. I had a wife, a son, in a town back east. There was a fire." His voice was flat-worn, smooth by a grief he had carried for too long. "I was the only one who made it out." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The shame was a physical weight. Maeve didn't touch him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just sat with him in the vast, star-filled silence, sharing the weight of his past as he had shared hers. After a long while, she spoke. "A fire takes," she whispered, "but the earth remains, and if you're patient, something new will grow." He finally turned to look at her. In her eyes he saw not pity, but a deep, profound understanding. She knew what it was to lose everything and be left behind. She knew the shape of survival. He reached out and took her hand. Her scarred, capable hand fit into his. It felt like coming home. "Maeve," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he thought had died in the fire. "I bought this land for the silence, to be alone." He squeezed her hand. "I was wrong. I wasn't looking for silence. I was looking for peace." He looked at her, the woman who was as wild and resilient as the land itself. "I think I just found it." Maeve leaned her head on his shoulder, her answer a quiet, contented sigh. The townsfolk could keep their stories of curses and ghosts. Here, on this small patch of forgotten land, 2 survivors had stopped running. They had found their own quiet harmony, not in solitude, but in the shared silence of a home they had built from the ashes together.